I'm one of those people who like rainy nights or even storms because there's something about it that makes me feel comfortable and relaxed. On nights like this, I always spend the night on the couch watching TV and listening to the rain. Fortunately, I didn't have work the following day, and even though it was already 8 p.m., there was a fairly large thunderstorm that night that was safe and sufficient to keep everyone inside for the remainder of the day. I picked up my phone and looked at the number, but I didn't recognize it. The area code was from this city, so I answered just in case. I'm always worried that it might be something important or someone I know, but I didn't have their number saved. Hello, no one said anything. I decided to make a hot cup of coffee and stay up as late as possible to enjoy the cozy night. I sat down and turned on a movie, and after only 20 minutes of the movie, my phone began to ring. I could tell it wasn't a dead line, though, because I could hear background noise and it was messy. After giving it some thought, I realized that someone was there, but they weren't talking, and I hung up because I couldn't really think of a reason why someone would call and say nothing. I assumed it must have been an error or some sort of scam, even though it wasn't the usual robot voice. Or whatever, I put my phone back on the end table and kept watching TV. I think I was about an hour into the movie when the storm outside became louder, like it was picking up thunder, lightning, and a lot of rain, and the TV and lights flickered before turning off and back on again in a split second. I stopped the movie and looked around, unsure of what was going on, and not even 30 seconds later, the power went out. I had a small candle that I hardly ever used, but I didn't want to waste the battery on my phone because I didn't know how long this would last. I lit the candle and decided to check the breaker box downstairs because the entire house was suddenly silent, the storm was twice as loud, rain was pouring onto the roof and against the windows, and there was heavy, continuous thunder for what seemed like 5 whole minutes. My phone was using 5G data, so I checked to see if there was any information on the status, but there was nothing. I went back upstairs and saw that the switch was loose, so I flipped it back and forth, but it was completely dead. I had nothing to do but watch the storm outside the window, and I also noticed that all the other houses down the street were dark, so it appeared to be a pretty bad power outage. I probably stood there by the window for about 15 minutes. I was listening to the storm when, out of the blue, I heard something outside the house. I instantly recognized it as the gate to my backyard swinging open. It had no lock, but it never just swings open like that. I had no idea what it could have been, so I went to the back of the house and looked out the back door. Despite the storm, the darkness, and everything else, I could see the shadow of a man who had obviously I had no idea what he was doing outside, but it gave me a bad feeling. I know I could have opened the door and yelled at him to leave my property, but I felt a little uneasy because he was standing in the middle of the backyard in the rain, and I could only really see his outline. He looked like a dark figure, and I couldn't tell if he was facing the house at me or away from it. I stayed by the door and watched him for a full minute until his arm slowly rose out of his pocket and he placed his hand by his head. I had no idea what he was doing, but I could see a tiny glowing light in his hand, and when I realized it was my phone, I realized that he was insane enough to be walking around outside in the middle of a huge storm like this and that it wouldn't be far off to assume that he had a gun or something. Started to ring in the other room. It took me only 2 seconds to realize that this stranger outside my house was calling me, which is why I could hear the rain on the other end of the phone earlier when he was silent. However, that was an hour ago, and during that time, he had been outside my house in the storm, standing there the entire time, freaking out. I rushed into the living room, got my phone, and made sure it was the same number, then I returned to the door without answering it. I felt foolish because I didn't like standing by the door knowing that the man might be watching me from somewhere outside while I couldn't see him. I went back to the living room and considered calling the police, but I wasn't sure what to say because I had received 2 calls from someone outside my house, but I had no evidence that it was the same person or that they were doing anything wrong other than being in my backyard. I was so freaked out that I jumped when my phone rang again, even though I was half expecting it. I ignored the call, and seconds later, there was a loud knock at the front door. As they continued to knock, the knocks were so strong that they shook the walls of the house. I put my phone on silent, and embarrassingly, I just froze and did nothing. I know how silly that sounds, but I've never been in a situation like that. I believe it took them 30 seconds to start beating the door more violently before I finally snapped out of it and called the police. My hands were shaking as I held the phone, and they said an officer was on his way right away, and they were about 4 minutes away. I kept telling them what I knew, and the man kept hitting the door. This continued for the whole time I was waiting. After waiting for the policeman to arrive, the operator finally said that they were on my street. A few moments later, I heard someone shouting, so I rushed to the window and saw the officer pursuing him. They fled into the storm, and I was unable to see anything else. I believe I waited for 2 minutes before the officer returned empty-handed, and the man managed to escape. I was truly impressed by how much the police department tried to assist me. The only real lead was the phone number, and it turned out to be a dead end. I tried thinking of anyone who would be out to get me like this, but I had no idea the case kind of died out, and since then I've never received any calls from that number or seen anything else. Music, Story 2, by J. Even though they conducted a fairly thorough investigation and seemed to take it seriously, probably because they actually saw and chased the guy. J, it's one of those things you think would never happen to you or that only happens in movies, but being that naive only makes it 100 times more terrifying if you are unfortunate enough to experience something similar. I was young at the time, in middle school, kind of at that age where I was. I can't remember exactly what year this happened, but I've never really been able to shake the horror I felt that night. This weekend was special even though my parents were taking a quick road trip to a city 8 hours away to relive their honeymoon or something, but I didn't care too much about the specifics because all I could think about was how I was growing up and feeling more like a man, which is silly to think about looking back. It was summer, so I spent most of my days hanging out with my friends outside or playing video games inside. My best friend Finn was gone when I woke up, but I texted him right away because I was excited to have the house to myself and invite my friends over for a sleepover with no rules to follow or anything. The only problem was that his parents wouldn't let him over if they knew there were no adults in the house, but after a little deception, Finn was allowed to come over, even though he wouldn't be at my house until later in the day, maybe 6 o'clock. Eager to see him when he arrived later, I opened the front windows. However, as soon as I did, I saw a man outside. The only reason I was concerned was because he was oddly close to the house, like past the sidewalk and somewhat close to the garage. He had a very distinctive appearance, with longish dark hair, a patchy beard, and a fairly tall and thin build. This made me uneasy, so I moved away from the window so I wouldn't be seen staring at him. A few minutes later, I didn't think it was worth mentioning, so I spent the rest of the day relaxing in my room playing Xbox until 6 o'clock. When Finn finally arrived, we got some food from the kitchen, went upstairs, and essentially locked ourselves in my room, playing video games for 5 hours straight. It was around 11:30, and of course we were still playing Xbox when he left the room to use the restroom, but he returned only 30 seconds later. Inquiring if I had heard that, I asked what I hadn't, but before Finn could respond, the entire house went dark, the TV and Xbox lights just went out, and I couldn't even see Finn standing 5 feet away in the doorway. I searched the floor with my hands, trying to find my phone, picking it up, and turning on the flashlight. For a brief moment, Finn and I were silent, probably because we weren't sure why the power had gone out so abruptly, but I was also listening for the sound Finn claimed to have heard a few moments before the blackout. I asked him again what he heard. He said he wasn't really sure, maybe a thump or a footstep on the floor below us with the power shutting off. We assumed it was probably just something to do with that, but we still didn't know why it shut off, and being young and alone in the house, it was still a little strange. We went out into the hallway and down to the first floor because it was unsettling to know that we kind of had to figure out what was going on. When we got out of the room, we heard the wind outside. It wasn't anything unusual, but it was enough to think that it might have caused a problem, or perhaps we were just looking for something to blame, but neither of us really knew what to do in this situation. For example, I knew there was an electrical box in the basement that I showed him to the basement, which was strange because the door was already open and nobody often goes down there because it was unfinished and there was nothing there but some storage and random old and used stuff, but I didn't know any specifics and I was apprehensive to try anything. I figured he might be able to figure it out, though. My parents were leaving on vacation, so I assumed they might have gone down to get some suitcases or something. We still had our phone flashlights on, so Finn led the way as we descended the creaky wooden stairs and entered the basement, which wasn't very large. It was more like a wide corridor with concrete walls and a few boxes and loose items stacked along the wall, but it was obviously very dark and I hadn't been over there all day because the basement door was kind of toward the back of the house. The electrical box was completely dark in front of our flashlights, so we went over to it. The panel covering it was partially open, and Finn looked around, but I think that now that he was down here, he was just as anxious about trying anything as I was. The main, larger switch was the only one that was flipped to the opposite side from all the others, but naturally, we had no idea what this meant. After a little hesitation, he flipped it over right away, and there was only a sliver of light shining down the staircase from the first floor, and the basement was still completely dark despite the faint beeping sounds and sporadic startup noises from all the appliances on the floor above us. We started walking back down the corridor to reach the stairs, but just before we reached them, a sudden shuffling sound came from the opposite side of the basement. We both stopped moving, so I shone my light in that direction. In the darkness, I saw a figure standing there, and I recognized him right away because he had long dark hair and a tall, thin build. He was standing somewhat behind some boxes, which cast a shadow over his face, making it difficult for me to tell if we were looking at him or not. If he was certain that we saw him, I turned and booked it up the stairs, and Finn followed closely behind me. I slammed the door behind us, and we both ran out the front door, understandably freaked out, and I called 911. As we stood there, with all the lights on in the other houses, it was fairly obvious that the man in the basement had turned off the electricity. As we were on the phone, receiving updates from the operator, we noticed a figure pass one of the downstairs windows, and 15 seconds later, they passed an upstairs window, which I believe was the one leading to my parents' room. Walking around but for the next few minutes we didn't see anyone else before the police came. They entered, but no one was there, and he had already left out one of the back windows. Naturally, my parents were called, and there were a lot of questions, but in the end, nothing came of it. There are a lot of terrifying things to consider regarding what happened that night or what might have happened, such as how long that man had been watching the house or my family for what precisely he was attempting to accomplish by breaking in, turning off the electricity, and then hiding in the basement. Fortunately, my parents were astute enough to relocate us out of that house quickly, and we hope that we never run into that man again. Story 3, by River W. I travel to my off-grid cabin in the Montana backcountry every few months. It's quite remote, which was ideal and the main reason I purchased. I had a 5-day weekend off from work in the fall, and since I hadn't done much planning, I decided to drive 3 hours north to my cabin on a whim. The drive was a little exhausting because I hadn't gotten any extra sleep before, and I arrived at the cabin at around 7:00 p.m. The place is great for short vacations to get away from everyone and just enjoy my time alone in the forests. It was a little challenging to navigate the forest that led to the cabin at dusk, but once I arrived at the front, I parked, unloaded my bag, and hurried it inside before turning around to start the generator. Since the entire cabin was powered by a gas generator, the lights, outlets, and even the electric stovetop were all powered by a single small generator. I never used much power anyway, so it was always enough for me. I filled up the gas tank, turned it on, and went inside to warm up. Up here in northern Montana, it gets pretty cold in the fall. I believe that at night, where my cabin was, it frequently dropped below 25 degrees Fahrenheit. The winters are harsh, so I don't even try to go to the cabin. I only stayed up for about an hour before bed. The following day, I spent most of the day cleaning, dusting everything off, and resealing some of the cracks in the cabin walls. However, I saw an old truck driving down the dirt trail to the cabin. I didn't give it much thought because I assumed they had somehow taken the wrong turn and probably had a cabin of their own somewhere nearby. However, as they approached, they stopped and sat there for maybe 5 minutes before turning around and leaving. At night, I think around 10 o'clock, I felt like taking in some nature and made a campfire on the front porch, which would give the wood stove more time to heat the cabin as well. Before I went to bed, I grabbed some old firewood. Starters I had left behind months earlier, so I went to the porch and lit up the small fire pit I had there. It was always so pleasant the first few nights at the cabin, listening to the forest and peaceful, quiet natural sounds, but I was only sitting outside for 5 or 10 minutes before the outdoor porch light abruptly went out. When I turned around, I saw that all of the lights in the cabin were also off, leaving only the faint orange glow from the fire pit. I thought it was just an old generator doing what old generators do best, which is to break down and not work properly, but after realizing that the noisy generator wasn't being all that noisy and wasn't running anymore, I got up and walked around back. Sure enough, it was off. I turned it on a few times, but after 10 good attempts, I gave up and kicked it out of frustration. I checked the grass for any signs of a leak or something, but there were none. I was really perplexed. I honestly didn't know how it was possible, but I didn't have any extra, so I was going to be without power until at least tomorrow morning when I could drive into town and get more fuel. I had just filled it up with a whole canister of gas when I got to the cabin last night, so there was almost no chance that it ran through it that quickly. It only took a few seconds to notice something out in the woods, a person, or at least something that looked like a person, among all the trees off to the right of the dirt trail I leaned on. I knew it wasn't a huge deal because I had the wood stove to heat the place and was going to bed soon anyhow, so I didn't really need lights or anything. I went back to the porch and sat down, trying to get calm and relaxed again so that I could at least enjoy the rest of my night. After a few minutes, I kind of gave up on staring at it because it wasn't moving at all and returned to just relaxing and listening to the quiet night. However, when I happened to glance back at the forest a minute later, I couldn't find it. I searched around for several more minutes, thinking I must have simply lost track of exactly what I was seeing. Where it was but still couldn't see it anywhere. I won't lie, that made me a little uneasy. I wouldn't say I'm paranoid, but that might have been one of the most unsettling things I've experienced in a long time. Of course, if it was just a bush or something, it should still be where I last saw it. The thought of it gave me chills, and for the next half hour, I kept my eyes fixed on the forest and the peaceful atmosphere that pervaded the area surrounding the cabin. When the generator cut out, I had the unsettling feeling that I wasn't alone and that someone was watching me. I suppose it would have been close to 12 a.m. I glanced out into the darkness in that direction, kind of waiting to see if anything moved, when I heard a quick sound to my left, like a stick falling on the ground, possibly from a tree or anything else. After 30 seconds, I turned to face. My heart nearly stopped when I saw that the figure was back standing in the same spot as before, but then I saw another and another. Maybe a dozen figures were standing between the trees about 100 yards away, all of them silent and motionless, hidden by the darkness, but unmistakably facing the cabin. My body went into flight mode, and I hurried inside the cabin, standing behind the door for a minute to gather my thoughts and consider whether or not to. I finally plucked up the courage to look out the window, and all of the figures were gone, and the forest was deserted. This nearly made me even more afraid than before, but I didn't have time to think because a few seconds later, I heard footsteps coming toward the back of the cabin. I think I heard 4 or 5 distinct footsteps, but there could have been more. I quickly closed the blinds on the front window and listened to all of these unknown voices. I listened to their boots thumping on the wooden porch just outside the door as they moved slowly around the cabin, but they all stayed grouped up as if they weren't actually surrounding the cabin or anything. I honestly thought this was it for me, and I didn't dare try to look out in a disturbing way. Whoever this group was outside my cabin, they weren't talking, and their only sound was their footsteps, but they all moved in unison. I stood there waiting for a few minutes, knowing that they were just standing on the other side of the door, probably waiting for me to try to leave or something. After 10 minutes, I finally decided to screw it and try to look out the window, so I cautiously walked over and moved just a small portion of the blinds so I could barely see through with one eye. It seemed like they knew what they were doing. I half expected the group to be waiting along the lonely dirt road because it was thin and went through the dark forest at night. They could have easily blocked it off or something, but I made it out without seeing anyone. The porch was empty, and the entire group had left without ever making a sound. I didn't even bother getting anything other than my car keys before running out of the cabin and getting into my car and leaving those woods. Other than that, I'm not really sure what I experienced at the cabin that night. There were a lot of people stalking me and creeping around the forest, probably draining my generator, but they didn't do anything. It doesn't make sense what they were even trying to do, and I don't have any answers, but if anyone has any ideas about who this group was or what they were trying to do, I'm interested in hearing them. Since I own the cabin, I will ultimately have to return, but to be honest, I'm afraid of the answers I might find there. Locate.